Hey, we're back now. In this particular PowerPoint, we're going to look at why did the colonists revolt against the British? You probably already watched John Green's, and he'll do a much better job. My goal here is to really try to highlight some of the key pieces that we need to understand. So the question is asked, well, why did the colonists revolt against the British? And what we need to understand is this idea of salutary neglect. Essentially, the British forgot about us. They forgot about the colonists because the colonists were essentially running everything so well. But the British, what you have to understand is they had big time troubles at home. There was an influenza outbreak. London burned down. The government was ineffectual, and Britain was at war with France. So they were really struggling. And when you struggle, you kind of leave some things that are going well for you by the wayside, and sometimes those kind of come back to bite you. The colonists as well during this time were doing really well. Individual colonies were thriving, actually very, very successful. So of course the British are going to kind of turn their head toward where the trouble areas are. And really the last thing that you need to understand is that the distance was so great. So if you can see on this, so here's Great Britain and here's North America over here. It literally took a month to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And so let's say, for example, a decision is made in the British Parliament. So that decision would have to be written down, put on a boat, transferred across. Then once it reaches the colonies, then the message has to be copied and then sent out to all the different colonies. So you may talk anywhere from 2 to 3 months just to get a decision from Great Britain spread out to the different colonies, and then to get a reply would take about that much time coming back. So we could talk anywhere from 3 to 6 months for any sort of big time decision to be written, sent, and then a response given. Now, Britain itself, you got to understand, with all its issues that are going on, they had some things that they did that really upset the colonists themselves. Now, so the first one is called the Proclamation of 1763. And you can see this red line here, and this red line represents essentially the Appalachian Mountains. And so what the British did in 1763 was to essentially say no colonists can be protected west of the Appalachians. The colonists will be protected within the 13 colonies, but across that, we cannot protect you. So therefore, we're going to close it down. And mostly because they did not have the large number of troops to be able to protect the colonists. Plus, this area over here was French. So the French kind of controlled this area. The British also at this time passed what's called the Townshend duties. And as you can see, it's taxed all the building materials and even tea. The governor's salary came from this. Essentially what the British tried to do was to make the colonies self-sufficient by essentially taxing all the goods. There was also there was a new law called the writs of assistance, where basically general search warrants were given to British soldiers and allowed them to search anywhere. And what you can begin to see, hopefully you're making some connections to things that happen further down the line, but the Fourth Amendment that we have in our Constitution protects us against unreasonable searches. And I think that really derives specifically from this writs of assistance. The British also passed what's called the Quartering Act. And what they did is to try to save money and to try to provide places for their troops to stay, would literally have troops stay in colonists' homes. Sometimes they would kick the family out, sometimes they wouldn't. And this really caused a lot of discontent with the colonists, because they're like, what are you doing? if you're going to create, or have a military presence, then what you're really going to want to do is you're going to want to create forts, and you have to supply them yourself. It is not our responsibility to supply them. And then probably the thing that most people are aware of, and that's the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed whereby the colonists had to have a stamp on all legal documents. So really anything that was printed had to have an official stamp on it. So imagine, anything you do, anytime you print something, anytime you pass anything out for public consumption, it had to have like a British seal on it, or it was considered counterfeit. So why would the British do these things to their own people? I mean, if you sit back and you think about it, why kind of impose all these very harsh restrictions on your own people? And it really comes down to control and money. If you think about it, you 17, 18, some of you probably 19, 20, 21, a couple of you 26, 27. How are you controlled? You're controlled through money. And so what the British tried to do was to really place very strict kind of encumbrances upon the colonists so that they really couldn't flourish on their own. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink here. And so really it's because of these actions that the Declaration of Independence was written. And we've already previously looked at it, the fact that Thomas Jefferson really pulled a lot of his material from John Locke's work. In particular, when you think about it, and we'll have a piece here in just a second that you'll see after this, the Declaration of Independence is a very, very strong document whereby the American colonists said enough is enough. And so they listed all of these grievances against the crown. And, it was a long list, and we'll look at those here in a couple minutes. But so you got to remember that the colonists were British. They did not want to break away. So why would they? So, whoops, we'll skip that. So what now? So after the war, and we're not going to pay any attention to the Revolutionary War because that really doesn't need to be addressed in this class or course. But what we're going to look at is like the first attempt of the colonists to try to create a government. And the first thing they did was to write the Articles of Confederation. You have to remember that this is the first constitution. It wasn't necessarily a perfect constitution. But what it did is it did create an organization that allowed the 13 colonies to begin to act as a nation. So what are some of the accomplishments? First of all, it helped us with dealing with foreign affairs. So it helped us with dealing as a united nation with France, with Spain. It helped us to survive the war. It marshaled resources, although not very well, but it marshaled resources to where they needed to be. It dealt with expansion. States began to grab land as much as they could, as fast as they could. So it began to create a system by which they could organize and grow. And like you can see, it began the colonists to think as a nation. Up until this point, people thought of themselves as Virginians. Sorry, there's my phone again. People saw themselves as Virginians. People saw themselves as somebody from Massachusetts or a South Carolinian. And so it really helped us to organize ourselves. Now the weaknesses, this is really what caused us ultimately to write a new constitution, which is the one that we have today. First of all, one of the biggest weaknesses was the fact that any sort of amendment, any sort of change required all 13 colonies to agree. If you've ever gotten 5 people together, to get 5 people to agree on something is nearly impossible. So to get all 13, very difficult. No, the new government had no national court system, so really no judicial branch. It had no executive branch. All the power lied with uh, the legislative branch. Congress didn't have any power to levy or collect taxes. So this is kind of a tough one because the Articles of Confederation really put forth a system whereby the states had to voluntarily give money to the national government. There was no way for the national government to kind of organize itself or to pay for anything. And so, as you can see, there was no power to levy or collect taxes. Congress had no power to enforce its law because there's no national police force. There's no FBI. There's no really national standing army. Armies were created or were existed only when the states provided militia. It also, the approval of 9 states were needed in order to enact a law. So 9 out of 13, that's almost 75%. Our current system only asks us to have a 51% majority, but here they wanted almost 75% majority. Nearly impossible. And probably the biggest one is Congress had no power to regulate trade. So what happens when a good is produced in Virginia and is sent to Massachusetts to be sold? Massachusetts could impose a tax on it. Massachusetts could sort of change any product from Virginia, either by forcing Virginia to change the product, maybe. It just caused big problems between the states because there was no overriding basically national government to kind of take away all the barriers. So in other words, what we really had was this really weak national government. The states held all the power. If we go all the way back up here and to look at, it's called the Articles of Confederation. If you remember, a confederation is where there is a loose organization amongst equal standing states. So there is no national government. The national government did exist, but it did not have any power. And really, the states didn't want it that way. They just came from a system where there was very strong absolute power. So what should the new nation do now? Well, in 1787, after the Revolutionary War, they decided that they were going to send some leaders or representatives to Philadelphia, and they were going to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now note, their objective was only to revise it. But what they found out very, very quickly was there were too many difficult issues with the Articles. So they just decided to write up a brand new Constitution. So they did it in secret, and this is where we have the Constitution.